I would be bringing my wife and children back to the UK at this point, and the things that they're going to miss is, well, everything.
Prince Harry has finally broken his silence, and the reaction across Britain is stunned disbelief. After years of unshakable loyalty, he spoke with a rawness no one expected, hinting at regret, distance, and a truth long buried. Some hear exhaustion, others hear quiet resentment, and a few sense strategic timing. Faces reportedly froze, phones lit up, and palace watchers went silent. Why would Harry choose this moment to speak now? Because the final line he delivered suggests that everything we thought we knew was only the surface. When silence spoke louder than loyalty. For the first time in years, Prince Harry stepped into the public eye and did something no one in Britain expected. He spoke without reaching for Meghan's name as a shield. There was no familiar praise, no careful reminder of how misunderstood she had been, no soft framing designed to guide listeners toward sympathy. The moment felt stark, almost unsettling, because the absence was unmistakable. Where there had always been a united front, a shared language of we and us, there was now only Harry standing alone in his words. It wasn't what he said that sent shockwaves through the UK. It was what he deliberately left out. Listeners leaned in, waiting for the familiar defense to arrive, for the tone to pivot toward protection or explanation. It never did. His voice remained measured, controlled, and strikingly neutral. Gone was the urgency that once colored every mention of his wife. Gone was the reflex to frame every controversy as a misunderstanding or an attack from the outside. Instead, his silence created a vacuum, and that silence quickly became the loudest statement he had ever made. British media picked up on the shift instantly. Commentators replayed the footage, not to dissect his wording, but to study the pauses, the careful choices, the lines he refused to cross. For years, Harry had been predictable in one way. No matter the question, he would always circle back to Meghan, positioning her as central, vulnerable, and wronged. This time, there was no circling back. The distance felt intentional, even strategic. It suggested that this wasn't a man struggling to explain himself, but someone quietly redrawing boundaries. What made the moment so powerful was how restrained it was. There was no anger, no accusation, no dramatic reveal. That restraint forced audiences to read between the lines. In a media culture used to explosive confessions and emotional monologues, Harry's refusal to defend spoke volumes. It hinted at a shift not just in tone, but in allegiance. The silence suggested separation, not of marriage necessarily, but of narratives. For the first time, Harry was no longer carrying someone else's story alongside his own. Across the UK, reactions ranged from confusion to disbelief. Headlines didn't scream scandal. They questioned meaning. Analysts asked why now and why this way. Royal watchers noted how rare it was for Harry to speak publicly without aligning himself explicitly with Meghan's perspective. That alignment had once been automatic, almost instinctive. Its absence raised uncomfortable questions. Has something changed behind closed doors? Was this a quiet correction, a subtle refusal to keep playing a role he had long accepted without challenge? What emerged was a new tone entirely. Harry wasn't trying to justify past choices or rewrite history. He wasn't asking for understanding. He was simply no longer explaining. And in a world where he had spent years over-explaining, that decision felt deliberate and deeply significant. The silence didn't feel like hesitation. It felt like resolve. It marked the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one where distance replaced defense, and where the story was no longer shaped by what Harry said out loud, but by what he chose at last to leave unsaid. So, what happens when Harry stops explaining entirely? Was that silent surrender or the first move in something far more dangerous? Keep watching. The moment the story tilted. If the first shift was felt in what Prince Harry refused to say, the second arrived in how carefully he chose his words. This was the point where the atmosphere changed, where listeners across the UK sensed that something deeper was unfolding beneath the calm surface of his remarks. As Harry spoke about the past, he didn't deny the decisions that had reshaped his life. He didn't distance himself from the relocation abroad, the high-profile interviews, or the painful fracture with his family. Instead, he acknowledged them plainly, almost clinically. But the way he framed those choices marked a clear departure from everything that had come before. Harry spoke as someone revisiting a path he once believed was solid. He explained that at the time he acted on what he understood to be true. The emphasis was subtle but unmistakable. These were not the words of a man rewriting history to escape blame. They were the words of someone reassessing the information that guided him. With each sentence, he shifted the focus away from emotion and toward context, inviting listeners to consider not just what happened, but why he believed those actions were necessary in the first place. As he moved through familiar territory, media appearances that sparked outrage, decisions that hardened family divisions, there was no defensiveness in his tone. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration. He spoke as though he were laying pieces on a table, not to accuse, but to show how the picture had been assembled. The implication hung in the air. If the foundation was flawed, then everything built on top of it deserved to be questioned. This was where the UK's attention sharpened. Commentators didn't hear bitterness or resentment. They heard doubt measured and deliberate. Harry suggested that some of the narratives he once repeated so confidently were not born from his own instincts or experiences. They were stories he accepted, trusted, and carried forward as truth. The idea was unsettling because it reframed years of public conflict. If those narratives weren't entirely his, then the image of Harry as the sole driver of rupture began to crack. What made this moment so powerful was its restraint. Harry didn't name names. He didn't point fingers. He didn't even describe himself as deceived. He simply acknowledged that belief and reality don't always align, especially when decisions are made under pressure. That admission alone was enough to ignite speculation. Was he saying he had been guided intentionally or not down a path he might not have chosen with fuller knowledge? Across Britain, the question spread quickly. Analysts replayed his words, parsing their meaning, weighing their implications. The conversation shifted from judgment to inquiry. Had Harry been acting on incomplete truths? Had the story the public accepted for years been built on assumptions that were never fully his own? The power of his statement lay in its openness. By reframing responsibility without rejecting it, Harry invited scrutiny not of his actions, but of the structure beneath them. As this realization settled in, it became clear that this was not an attempt to attack or assign blame. It was something more destabilizing. By exposing the fragility of the narrative's foundation, Harry wasn't tearing anything down outright. He was allowing the audience to see the cracks for themselves, setting the stage for questions that would not be so easily contained as the conversation moved forward. As Harry let silence expose the cracks, was this truth always hidden from him or carefully kept out of reach? Stay tuned. The truth he was never given. As the weight of Prince Harry's reframed reflections settled, a more unsettling layer began to emerge. One that shifted the focus from misunderstanding to omission. This was where the narrative took a sharper turn. Not through accusation, but through revelation. Harry began to acknowledge that some of the most explosive conflicts that defined his public life were shaped in rooms he was never in, through conversations he never heard and decisions he never fully understood at the time they were unfolding. For years, Meghan Markle presented herself publicly as restrained, patient, and reactive rather than confrontational. In interviews and carefully managed appearances, she appeared as the calm center of a storm created by others, by the press, by palace tradition, by external hostility. Harry believed that image completely. He stood beside her, convinced he was defending someone unfairly targeted. But insiders now suggest that behind that composed public posture, Meghan was far more active in driving the very conflict she claimed to endure. According to people close to the situation, Harry only recently became aware of how much communication had been happening without his direct involvement. Messages, discussions, and strategic exchanges reportedly took place while he remained focused elsewhere, trusting that he was being kept fully informed. He wasn't. Those closest to him say this realization didn't arrive all at once. But gradually, through small inconsistencies, delayed disclosures, and moments where outcomes didn't align with what he thought had been agreed upon, the picture that began to form was deeply uncomfortable. Meghan, sources claim, often positioned herself as the recipient of pressure while quietly influencing how situations escalated. She appeared publicly as the one under attack. Yet behind the scenes, she was shaping responses, steering narratives, and allowing tensions to rise. Harry, meanwhile, responded to the visible results. Media backlash, royal silence, public outrage without seeing the full chain of events that led there. This reframing casts his long silence in a new light. What once looked like unwavering loyalty now appears closer to unknowing participation. Harry wasn't staying quiet to protect Meghan from criticism. He was operating with incomplete information. He defended positions he thought were shared. Repeated explanations he believed were mutual and absorbed blame for outcomes he didn't fully author. The wars he fought against the press, against the palace, against public opinion were not always sparked by his own convictions. As this understanding took hold, it reportedly shook him deeply. Friends describe a man grappling not with betrayal in the dramatic sense, but with the slow realization that his role had been reactive, not directive. He had been responding to fires already burning, unaware of who had struck the first match. That awareness didn't make him angry so much as unsettled. It forced him to question not just individual moments but the entire framework of trust that guided his choices. The implications were devastating. If Harry had been shielded from critical details, then years of public conflict had played out on a distorted field. Meghan's portrayal as a passive target began to look more complex, even calculated, and Harry's silence, once praised as devotion, began to resemble something far more troubling. A silence built on not knowing what he was truly defending. As these pieces fell into place, it became clear that this reckoning was only beginning, and that the distance he was now creating was rooted not in rejection, but in the slow collapse of certainty he once relied on without question. So when Britain was cast as enemy, was Harry defending love or protecting a truth he was never allowed to see? Stay glued. When Britain was cast as the enemy. As Prince Harry's reassessment deepened, the focus widened beyond personal misunderstandings and into something far more unsettling. This was the moment that truly stunned Britain because it challenged a belief many had accepted without question, that the backlash against the UK was an unavoidable consequence of cultural tension and institutional rigidity. Harry's words suggested something else entirely. He implied that the hostility directed at Britain didn't simply happen. It grew, was reinforced, and in crucial moments was quietly encouraged. Rather than framing the public anger as a natural clash between modern values and old traditions, Harry spoke in a way that hinted at intention. He didn't accuse the country outright. Nor did he retreat into nostalgia. Instead, he drew attention to how quickly Britain became the convenient villain in a much larger story. Every criticism, every headline, every wave of outrage seemed to land in the same place. The UK was painted as cold, hostile, and unchanging, while responsibility for the escalating conflict drifted elsewhere, untouched and unnamed. What unsettled British audiences was the suggestion that this narrative served someone far more than it served the truth. Harry implied that directing frustration toward Britain created leverage. It simplified complex situations into a single digestible enemy. In that framing, nuance disappeared. Individual voices were drowned out, and the country itself became a symbol, absorbing blame that might otherwise have been questioned more carefully. For many watching, it felt like a sudden snap, a realization that this wasn't just about cultural misunderstanding, but about control of perception. The idea that public sentiment could be steered so effectively was deeply uncomfortable. Britain prides itself on debate, skepticism, and a free press. Yet, here was a suggestion that trust itself had been manipulated. The monarchy, often portrayed as the central target of criticism, was no longer the only casualty. Ordinary people, institutions, and even long-standing relationships between the public and the royal family were pulled into a storm that may have been amplified for strategic effect. Harry's tone remained calm, but the implications were explosive. He seemed to acknowledge that once Britain was positioned as the antagonist, everything else became easier to justify. Decisions appeared necessary rather than optional. Severed ties felt inevitable rather than chosen. The more intense the backlash grew, the more it validated a single storyline, one that thrived on division and left little room for reflection or doubt. For UK audiences, this reframing was jarring. Many had argued, defended, criticized, and debated based on what they believed was an organic breakdown between a couple and a country. Now they were being asked to consider whether that breakdown had been shaped, guided, and at times strategically fueled. It wasn't simply about culture or tradition. It was about how narratives gain power when they offer clarity, even if that clarity comes at the expense of truth. As this realization settled in, it became harder to ignore the cost. Public trust had been stretched thin, used as a tool rather than respected as a foundation. Britain wasn't just reacting anymore. It was recognizing itself as part of a story that may have been carefully arranged. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the certainty that once surrounded the past began to erode, leaving behind a far more complicated and troubling picture that refused to stay neatly contained. Now, as Britain looked closer, did it realize trust was traded for narrative control? And who truly benefited? Stay with us. When controversy became currency, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every high-profile controversy, every whispered scandal seemed to arrive with uncanny timing, often coinciding with critical business moves or media campaigns. It was as though the chaos itself had a schedule, a rhythm dictated not by chance, but by calculation. Sources close to Harry revealed a frustrating dynamic behind the scenes. Resistance from him often existed. He questioned the timing, the optics, the collateral damage. But his doubts were frequently overruled by an unrelenting push to control the narrative. In these moments, personal feelings were subordinated to brand strategy, and the stakes were anything but small. From the outside, it might have appeared as a string of unfortunate incidents, as though the public missteps were the natural fallout of a highly visible life. Yet, insiders paint a different picture, one where Meghan's influence and strategic instincts played a decisive role in orchestrating visibility. Controversy wasn't merely tolerated. It was leveraged. Pain, humiliation, and public backlash were treated as tools, as currency in a larger game where attention translated into opportunities. The United Kingdom, in particular, read these moments through a lens of calculated escalation, interpreting them less as human drama and more as a deliberate series of moves in a carefully curated play. One former aide described it as a relentless push-pull. Harry would bristle at the idea of launching statements immediately after personal attacks at the thought of headlines that painted him in a combative light. Yet the momentum from Meghan's side, driven by timing and an almost surgical sense of exposure, often prevailed. Campaigns would follow controversies. Carefully timed interviews, charitable announcements, and media appearances were deployed to recast the narrative, transforming what could have been purely damaging events into opportunities for visibility, influence, and ultimately control. The pattern was subtle yet unmistakable. Observers noted that the strategy wasn't just about personal branding. It was about establishing leverage. Each wave of negative press, each heated social media moment created openings to reset conversations on their own terms. What outsiders saw as missteps or mistakes were in many cases prelude to calculated returns, a high-profile announcement, a book deal, a philanthropic initiative designed to reclaim the spotlight. To insiders, the message was clear. Pain was not incidental. It was an investment, a necessary expenditure for a larger, more lucrative payoff. In this environment, Harry's hesitations were framed as caution. Meghan's decisiveness as necessity. Every move was scrutinized. Every reaction weighed for its potential to amplify attention. And while the world debated the personal consequences, the players behind the scenes knew that each moment of public discomfort carried hidden value, shaping public perception, sustaining relevance, and ensuring that no matter the fallout, the brand always came first. So, how did Harry shift from partner to product when every hesitation fueled a brand built on calculated discomfort alone? When Harry became the target, it wasn't a single moment of realization. It was a creeping, undeniable pattern that settled over Harry with heavy weight. Time and again, blame seemed to find him. No matter the circumstances, he was the prince under scrutiny, the scapegoat for missteps. The exile painted as both victim and villain. Each controversy, each carefully timed storm of public attention landed squarely on his shoulders. Those closest to him began to notice the rhythm. While Harry absorbed the backlash, Meghan remained unscathed, calm, composed, seemingly untouched by consequence. Her distance was striking, her poise unshaken, and the contrast only deepened the sense of injustice he felt. Friends and aides described it as a painful revelation. In private conversations, Harry began to trace the threads of each scandal, each media misstep, and saw the pattern emerging with cruel clarity. When headlines attacked, when public opinion turned sharp, he bore the brunt. When opportunities arose, when narratives needed steering, she moved freely, influencing outcomes without exposure. Her silence acting as a shield. Sympathy, which had once been scattered, began to consolidate sharply toward him as observers recognized the stark imbalance in accountability. The more the world criticized him, the more she seemed to gain influence, quietly navigating the fallout to her advantage. This dynamic was more than unfair. It was isolating. Harry, accustomed to duty and scrutiny as part of a royal life, found himself alone in the storm, while Meghan's calculated calm allowed her to sidestep the fallout. Harry's every reaction, every statement, every attempt to defend himself became fodder for further criticism. Those who knew him described long nights of reflection, a sense of betrayal, and the quiet, knowing understanding that his role in this carefully choreographed narrative was always predetermined. He was unwillingly the public face of conflict, the one expected to absorb judgment, while others maneuvered unscathed behind the scenes. What made the realization even more piercing was the emotional weight of it. Harry had not only to manage external pressures, but also the internal toll of watching a partner remain distant amid chaos he could neither fully control nor escape. Each misstep attributed to him, each whisper of blame carried the sting of injustice. It was in these moments that the story of sympathy shifted. Observers and insiders alike began to see Harry not just as a participant in controversy, but as the one repeatedly sacrificed for another's gain. His pain was no longer collateral. It was the very currency of influence quietly traded behind a veneer of composure that shielded Meghan from harm. As the pattern became undeniable, Harry's perspective shifted. What had once been a shared journey now appeared orchestrated, and his role unmistakable. He was the one to fall, to carry the blame, to face the public eye's harshest scrutiny. She remained untouched, her silence both protective and potent, while he bore the brunt of consequences that were never his alone. In understanding this, the narrative changed and the story of sympathy tilted sharply, spotlighting the emotional and public cost he endured while the strategy quietly advanced on the other side. But how did Harry realize he was carrying the blame alone? And what happens when the silent architect gets exposed? The moment Harry couldn't stay hidden. For years, the weight of public scrutiny had pressed on Harry, shaping his every decision, every appearance, every word. He had endured blame, criticism, and judgment, while watching the one closest to him navigate controversy, untouched, her silence acting as both shield and strategy. Yet, the final trigger, the moment that forced him to speak, did not come from outside, from the UK, the palace, or the press. It came from within. The shocking realization of how much had been withheld from him, how long the truth had been kept just out of reach. It was not resentment of the media that broke him, nor frustration with royal protocol. It was the knowledge that he had been allowed, perhaps even guided, to serve as a protective barrier, absorbing consequences while others remained untouched. Sources close to him describe a growing sense of betrayal as the layers peeled away. Harry's reflections revealed a life lived in partial shadows, a narrative carefully controlled in which he had been the primary actor but not the author. Each revelation deepened his understanding of the imbalance, showing that his silence had inadvertently supported a system that had long exploited it. The realization was bitter. He was not only the public face of controversy, but the instrument through which influence was maintained. Sympathy already consolidated around him in previous chapters of his life now intensified. The picture that emerged was stark. He had been used and the cost had been almost entirely his own. He did not speak to punish or vilify. There was no desire for retribution. Instead, he spoke to reclaim agency, to draw a line between personal truth and public narrative. Speaking was not about reconciliation. It was about separation. The deliberate distinction between what he had endured and the reality others had shielded themselves from. Every interview, every statement, every public revelation was a declaration of autonomy. It was an assertion that his experiences, his pain, and his perspective could no longer be co-opted or manipulated to shield someone else from accountability. Those around him observed a transformation. The careful restraint of the past gave way to a controlled, deliberate transparency, a refusal to continue absorbing fallout in silence. Friends and insiders note that there is a chilling clarity to Harry's new approach. The decision to speak now was not reactionary. It was strategic. The culmination of years of reflection and quiet observation. He understood the stakes, the public gaze, and the potential backlash. Yet the imperative to assert his truth outweighed any fear of consequence. Each revelation, each story shared was calculated not to inflame but to illuminate, to draw boundaries and ensure that his voice was no longer silenced, redirected, or co-opted. The implications were unmistakable. More would come, but it would no longer be a shared narrative. The carefully managed appearances, the collaborative media moments, the public image of unity, they were gone. What remained was clarity, a declaration that his truth was his own and that moving forward he would no longer serve as a shield. Observers saw this as the ultimate turning point. What had once been private frustration had become a public reckoning, a statement of independence and a refusal to bear consequences for the benefit of another. In understanding why he spoke, the story shifts from blame to revelation, from suffering to agency. It was not vengeance, nor anger, nor an attempt to rewrite history. It was, above all, a reclamation of self, a deliberate separation of narratives that had long been intertwined, and a warning that the era of silence had ended. Harry's voice, once muffled by circumstance and loyalty, now carried with deliberate weight, signaling that the next chapter, whatever form it might take, would be his alone. So, what do you think finally pushed Harry to break his silence? Was it quiet regret, withheld truths, or a line he refused to cross? Does this change how you see everything? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.